What's the difference between men and women? How do they differ? Well, the first thing we might observe is that if you look at personality differences between prepubescent boys and girls, they're not very large. And boys and girls don't differ in terms of their trait neuroticism, for example. What happens is that when puberty kicks in, women's trait neuroticism rises, and it stays higher than men's for the rest of their lives. When they're married, they get a little bit easier because they seem to be undertaking that process themselves. This is why you see this reflected in the different kinds of psychopathology that beset the two. Men are overrepresented in alcoholism, drug abuse, antisocial personality, and a host of learning disorders, as well as attention deficit disorder. Women are overrepresented in depression and anxiety primarily. That seems to be tightly associated with higher levels of trait neuroticism, because maybe if you're at the 95th percentile or higher, let's say, in trait neuroticism, there isn't much difference between that and being somewhat prone to depression and anxiety. Because the curves overlap, the curves aren't identical, the normal distributions aren't identical for men and women. You tilt the women's curve to the right towards higher levels of neuroticism. If you go out and look for the person in 20 who has the highest levels of negative emotion, it's much more likely to be female than male. Okay, so let's see if we can figure out why. I'm going to tell you some things, basic differences between men and women, and you can tell me what you think about it, if you agree or disagree. First, a size differential emerges between men and women at puberty, right? Boys and girls are roughly the same size and roughly the same strength, but men get bigger at puberty when the testosterone kicks in. That's more importantly, not only do they get taller and heavier, but their upper body strength is much higher. That's a real issue for combat because human beings punch. Other animals do that too. Kangaroos do that too. So we're not the only species that punches. But we have clubs on the ends of our arms. And that's how we defend ourselves. If you have a lot of upper body strength, especially across the shoulders, and you're heavier, then you can step into the punch and it's a lot more devastating. Now, it is the case that if you look at the statistics for physical altercations in marriage, women attack their husbands more often than husbands attack their wives. And you might think, why is that? Well, let's assume there isn't any reason other than both people in a relationship can get upset, and the women know that if they hit their husbands, nothing's really going to happen. If you're a woman about that height and your husband is, say, my height, unless you hit me with an object or something sharp, the probability that you're going to do me any serious damage is pretty low. You might hurt me, but if I do the reverse and hit you, and I really hit you, it's a completely different story. So at least one of the reasons why women can be more physically aggressive in minor ways in a relationship is because everyone knows, both the wife and the husband, equally, that the consequence of physical aggression is much more limited. Men do more serious damage to women, but women are more aggressive in relationships. That's interesting. Okay, so there's a body size difference that's important and a strength differential that's important. Next thing, let's assume that the reason women are higher in sensitivity to negative emotion is because the world is actually more dangerous to women. That would be the most logical reason why there would be a sex difference in something like fear or sensitivity to punishment. However, it appears that first there's the danger of physical altercation. Second, there's the sexual danger. Women become sexually vulnerable at puberty. Why do I say vulnerable? Well, it's straightforward. It's because the cost of sex for women is way higher than it is for men, or at least it certainly has been throughout our evolutionary history. If a man has an unwanted sexual encounter, well, he walks away. Maybe he's prosecuted by the state for it. But if a woman has an unwanted, unwarranted, or incautious sexual encounter and ends up pregnant, then in traditional societies, you're just done. Even in modern societies that are rich like ours, it's still a big problem. I don't have to go into that. It's big trouble no matter what you do about it. Being more nervous about that makes perfect sense. Here's the last thing. I think that women's nervous systems are not adapted to women. I think women's nervous systems are adapted to the mother-infant dyad. You're not the same creature when you have an infant, not at all. You're way more vulnerable, and it's partly because you have to express the vulnerability of the infant and care for it. Think about an infant, especially under 9 months old. How are you going to be wired up if you're going to optimally care for an infant under 9 months? Women generally do the bulk of childcare for infants under 9 months old. Part of the reason is breastfeeding. Both an infant under 9 months is very demanding because they're completely helpless. Demanding 24 hours a day. It's quite an emotional load. An infant under 9 months is never wrong. When they're in distress, you always respond. You never tell an infant to get its act together and stop whining. That's something you can say to a child that's 18 months old. But under 9 months, nothing is the infant's fault. They're surrounded by an extraordinarily threatening world, and you have to be responsive to what they need, regardless of what you want. You have to be very sensitive to threats in the environment. I think the price women pay for that ability to have an intimate relationship with infants is that their nervous systems are wired to perform that role optimally. The disadvantage is that temperament doesn't work as well when dealing with adult men, especially in a business environment. Because it's not the same thing, not at all. It's a competitive environment. Agreeable people are compassionate and polite. What are disagreeable people like? They're tough-minded, blunt, competitive, and they won't do a damn thing they don't want to do. It isn't exactly that they're aggressive, although they will push you the hell out of their way if you're in the way. They're not volatile like you are if you're high in neuroticism. It isn't defensive aggression, it's more like predatory aggression. It's dominance behavior. For someone who is highly disagreeable, they look at the world as a place in which they can compete and win. I'll tell you a story. I have a friend, I gave him my personality test, the Big 5 aspect scale that Colin DeYoung developed. And I knew he was a disagreeable guy from interacting with him. I mean, he's even rude to people sort of spontaneously on the street. I actually like him quite a bit. He's very, very funny. He's also very conscientious, so you can trust him, but he's disagreeable as hell. So I gave him this test because I thought it would be funny, and he came out as the most disagreeable person in 1,0,0,0. Reasonable in compassion, about 30th percentile, but like 0.1 in politeness. He's extraordinarily blunt, and he'll just say absolutely anything, no matter how horrible it is. He was often brought into corporations to clean them up. If a corporation was tilting and not doing well, they'd bring him in to find out who the useless people were and fire them. And I talked to him about that because I've had the misfortune of having to let go of graduate students in my lab, for example, who weren't performing well. I find it very, very difficult to dress someone down, and certainly difficult to fire them. I just hate it because I'm actually quite an agreeable person, much to my chagrin. And I asked him about that. I said, what do? You have to fire people all the time. How do you handle that? He said, handle it? I enjoy it. I thought, wow, that's so interesting that someone would have that response. I said, what do you mean you enjoy it? He said, look, I go into these companies and I analyze the performance of groups of people, right? In those groups, there are people who are really striving, really trying hard, and working themselves really hard and being productive. And then there are these people that are just doing nothing. They're completely in the way. They don't carry their weight at all. They take advantage every chance they get, and they're always whining about why they can't work. I find out who they are, call them into my office, and tell them exactly what they've been doing. I say, hit the road, buddy. You've had your run of it. And then I thought, oh yeah, okay, fair enough. I've had situations in my lab where I had underperforming graduate students. One of the things that was really awful about that was that it was really hard on the high-performing graduate students. They felt that even being in the same category as the people who weren't working hard and pulling their weight devalued what they were doing. That's exactly right. This is also why there's a conscientiousness trait and an agreeableness trait. Conscientious people judge you on your accomplishments, right? They don't give a damn about your feelings, not a bit. It's like, are you doing the work or not? Whereas agreeable people think, well, you know, your mother's sick and you've got a bunch of family problems and we all have to take care of each other, so it's no wonder you're having a rough time. And you can't say that one of those attitudes is correct and the other isn't correct. You can't say that there wouldn't be those two dimensions if there wasn't something correct about both of them. But you can certainly point out that often they conflict. The demand for inclusiveness, unity, and care, and the demand for high-level performance in a hierarchical structure are very different orientations in the world. Hence, personification. Hierarchical beings in the world is basically sort of the idea of being good. It's complicated for people who are agreeable and conscientious. Actually, I think often that large corporations and large institutions of any sort run on the unheralded labor of people who are high in agreeableness and high in conscientiousness. And they're disproportionately women. My experience in large institutions has been that if you want to hire someone to exploit, productively, you hire middle-aged women who are hyper-conscientious and who are agreeable. They'll do everything, they won't take credit for it, and they won't complain. That's nasty, and I think that happens all the time. One of the things you have to be careful of if you're agreeable is not to be exploited, because you'll line up to be exploited. I think the reason for that is because you're wired to be exploited by infants. And that just doesn't work so well in the actual world. One of the things that happens very often in psychotherapy is that people come for multiple reasons, but one of them is that they're often too agreeable. What they get is so-called assertiveness training, although it's not exactly assertiveness that's being trained. What it is the ability to learn how to negotiate on your own behalf. One of the things I tell agreeable people, especially if they're conscientious, is say what you think. Tell the truth about what you think. There are going to be things you think that are nasty and harsh, and they probably are nasty and harsh, but they're also probably true. You need to bring those up to the forefront and deliver the message. It's not straightforward at all, because agreeable people do not like conflict, not at all. They smooth the water, and you can see why that is. In accordance with the hypothesis that I've been putting forward. You don't want conflict around infants. It's too damn dangerous. You don't want fights to break out. You know, and you don't want anything to disturb the relative peace. If you're also more prone to being hurt physically and perhaps emotionally, you're also maybe loath to engage in the kind of high-intensity conflict that will solve problems in the short term. A lot of conflict takes a lot of intensity to solve problems in the short term. If that can spiral up to where it's dangerous, which it can if it gets uncontrolled, it might be safer in the short term to keep the water smooth and to not delve into those situations where conflict emerges. The problem with that is it's not a very good medium to long-term strategy. Lots of times, there are things you have to talk about because they're not going to go away. Partly what you do with agreeable people is you get them to figure out, and they have a hard time with this too, what they actually want. If you ask a disagreeable person what they want, they'll tell you right away. They know. It's like, this is what I want, and this is how I'm going to get it. But agreeable people, especially if they're really agreeable, are so accustomed to living for other people, finding out what other people want and trying to make them comfortable, that it's harder for them to find a sense of their own desires as they move through life. Look, there are situations where being agreeable is advantageous, but it's certainly not advantageous if you're going to try to forge yourself a career, right? That just doesn't work at all. And here's why. Large organizations reward people who can negotiate for themselves, stand their ground, and set boundaries. If you're overly agreeable, you'll end up taking on too much, not being recognized for your efforts, and potentially being exploited. The same holds true in relationships. Being agreeable might mean avoiding conflict in the short term, but over time, unresolved issues pile up and resentment can grow. Sometimes addressing those issues takes intense, uncomfortable conflict. Agreeable people struggle with this because they're wired to avoid confrontation, especially in situations where the stakes feel high. This avoidance often ties back to their natural predisposition to care for others. Agreeable people are so focused on keeping the peace and ensuring everyone is happy that they fail to assert their own needs. This tendency works beautifully in caregiving roles, like raising infants, but it becomes a significant hurdle when navigating adult relationships or professional environments. Now, Derek, because your loved one can get sick, your life takes on a new meaning. What are you to yourself? That's why assertiveness training is so crucial for agreeable individuals. It's not about becoming harsh or domineering. It's about learning to express your needs clearly and directly. It's about finding a balance, being compassionate but firm, caring but honest. There's a level of integrity in these skills that allows people to withstand pervasive abuse and not run away. You don't have to abandon your agreeableness, but you do need to learn how to temper it so it doesn't come at the expense of your well-being or success. If you're an agreeable person, start by practicing small acts of assertiveness. Speak up when you feel overlooked. Set boundaries when you feel overwhelmed. And most importantly, remind yourself that advocating for your own needs isn't selfish. It's necessary. Because when you take care of yourself, you're in a better position to take care of others.